Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Jennifer Campos to give us a research seminar today. So Dr. Campos is, did I pronounce your last name correctly? Is a Canada Research Chair, Tier 2 in Multisensory Integration and Aging. She's currently a Senior Scientist, Chief Scientist of the Challenging Environments Assessment Laboratory and Associate Director, Academics of KITE, Toronto Rehabilitation Institute, University Health Network. Jennifer is also Associate Scientific Director of AgeWell, NCE, and Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology of University of Toronto. Her research focuses on multisensory self-motion perception of and mobility, including standing, balance, walking, and driving under realistic and challenging conditions. I really appreciate you accept our invitation. So I'm gonna now turn the podium to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for the invitation. It was exciting for me to learn about this group actually, and to hear about some of the research that you're doing as well. I'm going to spend the first part of my talk actually is going to provide a bit of an introduction to KITE, the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute, because I do think as mobility researchers and based on my understanding of your group, there's a lot of engineers and technical folks. And so I thought if you aren't already familiar with the facilities at KITE, then that would be perhaps of interest. And then I think I was first connected with your group in my capacity as the Associate Scientific Director of AgeWell, which is Canada's Aging and Technology Network. So I'm going to give a little brief overview of AgeWell, because I do think there's some exciting opportunities that you could be aware of, but should be aware of. And then I'll launch into the scientific component of my talk. So just to give you a highlight of KITE, Toronto Rehabilitation Institute, KITE stands for Knowledge, Innovation, Talent Everywhere. It's a teaching and research hospital that is fully affiliated with the University of Toronto. It's part of the University Health Network, so that's a collection of hospitals in downtown Toronto, including cancer centers and acute care hospitals, and we are the largest rehabilitation research hospital in Canada. It's quite a translational research facility. So we have kind of three main goals, loosely categorized in terms of research priorities with respect to prevention. So prevention of illness, prevention of injury due to falls, for example, vehicle collisions. So a big program in prevention, program in restoration of function, which is what most people think of when they think of rehabilitation. If someone has experienced a stroke, a spinal cord injury, a cardiac event, for example, how do we get them back up to fully functioning as much as possible? And then the third one is aging well. And so how do we allow older adults to live with good quality of life for as long as possible? And AgeWell is actually hosted at KITE at UHN, and I'll tell you more about AgeWell in a minute. I have put some QR codes throughout, so feel free to scan those if you want some more information about some of the things I'm talking about. So I hope this works. It's just a little, it's maybe about a 40-second sizzle video, a little bit promotional, but it gives you some overview of some of the research that's being done at KITE.
Caught up on the line, got a string along. If you remember who am I? I'm a boss and I'm honestly up a rocker, but follow me, I'm ahead of the game. Believe it's singing and working overtime. I was swimming in the sun with the melody, the vibe. I'm a prodigy, logically, I'm impossibly wanted. They never remember my name. They remember my name. I'm fine with them applying. It's always taking the tank until it's time. You can roll with me and you can roll with me.
So hopefully you got some of that. I suspect probably the video wasn't optimized, but feel free to visit the KITE website as well to get more information. Some of the facilities that you would have seen featured in that video are part of what we call the Challenging Environment Assessment Lab. It's one of many labs that we have at KITE, but SEAL is comprised of a few different components. So we actually have a big motion platform. So what you see on the left-hand side, this is a 6 degree of freedom hydraulic motion platform. And you'll see that here we have a cube on top. This is a room. This is a lab. The lab is portable, actually, and we have 4 of them. And so each of these 4 labs, which I'll tell you about briefly, stair lab, winter lab, driver lab, and street lab, they can all be removed off the motion platform, parked in another room, used all at the same time if motion's not required, or they can be put on this motion base if motion is required. Why might we need motion? I think the most intuitive one is perhaps the research we do in driver lab. If you are simulating the experience of driving a vehicle, then you want to have the accelerations and feel the physical movements that you would normally experience during driving. But sometimes we also want to just change the inclination of the ground surface. In Winter Lab, we study a lot of we have a lot of research questions around mobility during winter, including the optimization of footwear. So how do we optimize footwear to be most slip resistant during winter conditions, and also different mobility aids such as accessibility scooters and walkers. And so the world is not flat. So sometimes we need to tilt the ground surface in order to be able to test the abilities of these footwear or mobility aids. So we can put it on the motion base, change the inclination of the surface and adapt it and adjust it to different slopes and cross slopes that mimic the types of things people might be experiencing in their everyday lives. They do post the results of all of their winter footwear testing. They've tested now hundreds of boots from the biggest brands, and they post them on a website called ratemytreads.com. And so you can see some really simple evidence of knowledge to practice in the context of winter footwear testing. Sometimes we need motion because we want to test the ability of the built environment to keep us safe. One example is some of the work that we do in stair lab. Stair lab, we can configure actually all different types of the built environment. Here you can see stairs. Allison Novak, Dr. Allison Novak, who's actually featured in this photo, does a lot of research in handrail and stair geometry design. And so she might be interested and has been interested in understanding the optimal design of handrails, the height, the shape, the profile, even the color, the materials. And so if we put stair lab on the motion base, we can create balance perturbations or disturb people's balance, put them off balance. You'll see there's obviously a robotic harness system that protects them. And then we can see the effectiveness of those different handrail designs in supporting and protecting people. And then the last one I'll mention is Street Lab. This is a sort of cave-based, projection-based virtual reality system where we can introduce all kinds of multisensory, multitasking challenges to people as reflective of their everyday lives. So the reason we have SEAL in a rehab hospital and research facility is because we want to be able to translate research from lab to life. And in order to do that, simulators in VR have a few unique features. One is that they are safe and they are controlled compared to the real world, which is very busy and noisy, but they're also realistic and have elements of ecological validity, unlike some traditional lab or clinic environments where it's very isolated, a bit impoverished, and not necessarily reflecting the realistic challenges people experience. So this is the reason that we have SEAL at Toronto Rehab and at KITE. Here's just a little video to put it in context of Driver Lab.
I'll be your host. Driving can get harder as we get older. The good news is that we're working hard to understand how to keep people safe on the road. Welcome to Driver Lab. Come, join me. Don't be shy. Come on, let's go for a spin. Feels just like a real car. How do we do it? You're totally surrounded by screens. When you turn, the whole car turns, and this is the motion platform. Thanks to these hydraulics, the whole lab moves. This makes the people inside feel like they're really driving. We can even simulate tricky conditions like blinding headlights and rain. It was nice meeting you, but I'm late for my class. Bye.
Okay, so again, hopefully that video worked. That's Anna. She's our Institute Director's daughter, and she was not old enough to drive when that video was filmed. These are 3 labs. I won't go into too much detail here that live on our 12th floor. We have Home Lab, which is a sort of modest income home, a single-story home, where we test a lot of at-home monitoring systems and age tech that can be integrated into the home, smart home technologies. Care Lab, which is a typical hospital environment, and Falls Lab, which is another motion platform that moves horizontally and allows us to do balance perturbations during steady state gait. Okay, and as I mentioned, AgeWell, while it is a national consortium, it's across Canada. It is based at UHN, but it really consists of 46 member universities and research centers. I'm sure that it's quite possible some people on this call are already affiliated with AgeWell in some capacity. It's really focused on early stage development of technologies, but also all the way up to commercialization and adoption. Importantly, we have a lot of end user engagement, and we have a lot of co-designed, co-assessed technologies with older adults and caregivers. Several startups, 56, I think that's probably an outdated number, have been supported by AgeWell. And we have well over 1,000 highly qualified personnel or trainees. We have 8 challenge areas that we typically focus the research and technology development on, and you can have a look at the kind of range. These were developed in consultation with many people across the country, including during a cross-Canada roadshow where they went into the communities in all the provinces across Canada to engage with older adults, policymakers, researchers, and others in order to define these challenge areas. And of course, in relevance to this group is that there is one of our primary challenge areas is in the context of mobility and transportation. And for the trainees in the room, I do want to bring to your attention that there is an EPIC program that is provided or geared towards trainees. It's a really wonderful training program for age tech. You get certificates, you get access to all different kinds of workshops, networking events. They support innovators in their quest for developing startups, for example. And so this is something, if you're interested, that you should most certainly look into. Okay, now moving on to my particular research program. My research looks at multisensory integration. So how do we integrate information from our various sensory systems in the brain? What happens in the context of sensory declines? Mostly age-related sensory declines is what I look at. And over the course of aging, and I look at this from the context of some of the fundamentals, some basic behavioral neuroscience approaches, and look at applications related to driving, falls, and dementia. And I'll mostly be talking about the driving and falls related research today. Okay, so as a quick brief agenda, I'll be covering what is sensory integration, how does it change with older age, and why should mobility researchers care? Defining what multisensory self-motion perception means and how we can study it and look at it with different methodologies, perceptually and behaviorally in younger and older adults. And then I thought it would be interesting to this group if I presented a little of the work that we're doing in the context of hearing on mobility, because I do think it's a under-recognized contributor to mobility, and it is indeed a risk factor for falls. Okay, so this is how our sensory systems have typically been treated in the context of research and also in the context of clinical application, and that's in silos. So hearing is typically assessed and studied separately from vision, separately from our vestibular system in our inner ear, separately from our somatosensory systems like proprioception and tactile inputs. But of course, this is really not at all how these sensory systems are interpreted by the brain. They are integrated actually at very early stages of processing, and they inform each other, and perception is influenced jointly by our sensory systems at any given time, and very rarely in isolation. And of course, multisensory integration is critical for everything that we do in the context of communication and, of course, in the context of mobility. The fact that you're able to sit upright right now or stand upright, listen to me, hear me, and see me all at the same time means that your brain has this extraordinary capacity to integrate these things nearly instantaneously. And that is not a trivial task. In the context of mobility specifically, and this is where most of my work lies, we obviously have our inner ear balance system supporting mobility, as well as dynamic and stable visual inputs, auditory information coming from auditory landmark cues, but also acoustical flow and proprioceptive information that we get from our muscles and joints as we move. But of course, the sensory systems and sensory inputs to the brain are not always entirely reliable. We have reduced visual reliability at night or foggy conditions. Auditory inputs can get very noisy in busy environments. And so what our brain typically does is it actually combines information from across our sensory systems in order to weight them according to their relative reliability. And so when you have poor vision or reduced visual sensitivities, then you may upweight the information that you're getting from hearing or from your vestibular system when you move around, for example. And so it's nearly always to the benefit of the brain to integrate across our sensory systems, which increases the reliability of our perceptual estimates and the effectiveness of our behavior. And when we think about aging in particular, we also have to contend with declines in our sensory systems. So not just environmental constraints and environmental challenges, but also declines in the sensory systems themselves, which is in the case of vision loss, which is very common, especially with respect to visual acuity, which luckily can be corrected, but not all can. From a cognitive perspective as well, changes to cognition, and of course age-related changes to hearing, such as age-related hearing loss. And so it is in these circumstances, when you're experiencing age-related declines, that relying on multiple sensory inputs is actually even more important. And I describe that here a little bit further. What I show here is that for this younger person, integrating across sights and sounds and our balance detectors and our proprioceptors is always going to increase the precision of our estimates to guide behavior in young adults. When we look at older adults, what we often see in my research and in the research of other people as well, is that we observe heightened integration in older adults. And what I mean by heightened integration is that older adults benefit more from having more sensory inputs compared to younger adults. And that makes sense when you think about it intuitively, which is if you start to have declines across all of your sensory systems, then you benefit more from using all of that information. When you're younger, you may be able to just rely on what you see or just rely on what you hear to perform a lot of everyday activities. And so you might not need the other senses as much. But when you have declines across your sensory systems, you need those other sensory systems to corroborate and to provide that redundant information in order to give your brain greater confidence in making those estimates. And of course, if you have age-related sensory impairment, so not just declines, which are very common and typical, but a clinically significant impairment, then of course, your need to rely on your remaining intact senses is even higher. Now, the problem is that having heightened integration in older adults is not always a good thing. So you can imagine that if there was a conflict between what you saw and what you heard, and they weren't telling you the same thing, or maybe there's some interference or distraction that's coming from one sensory input compared to the other. In that case, if you're obligatorily integrating across these senses, you have heightened integration, it may actually cause you to have perceptual or behavioral decrements because of this enhanced integration. So these principles that I just mentioned about the benefits of multisensory integration, we actually see evidence of this back in the very foundational work in the 80s in single cell superior colliculus neurons. Multisensory neurons have they have greater firing rates when they have two senses, bimodal inputs compared to unimodal or one sense inputs. And we know that this is true also for very basic tasks, computer-based tasks. Far less is known about the multisensory principles and how they change with age in the context of more complex behaviors, like in the context of mobility. And that's where my research has really focused. And the different experimental approaches and techniques that I've used, a little bit of neuroimaging, quite a few basic perceptual tasks, implementation of computational models, basic models like maximum likelihood estimation and Bayesian models of multisensory integration. But the one that I'm going to focus on today are some of the work that we've done using our simulators and virtual reality systems. And just to bring this picture back up again, because now that I've kind of laid that, given you some background information about studying multisensory integration, I want to emphasize that the use of VR and simulators are actually really well suited to study multisensory integration because you can strategically control each of the individual sensory inputs. And so you can manipulate what people see and you can manipulate what people hear, and you can do that strategically in real time. And so a lot of the research that we do exploits that aspect of virtual reality, which is to systematically control and manipulate sensory experiences. Okay, so the first study I'm going to tell you about is a really simple one where we wanted to see whether some of those multisensory principles I just talked about would be observed in a more realistic or more complex task. And in this case, we chose driving and how that might change with older age. And this work was done by my former student, Robert Ramkilawansing. Okay, so we all know that driving is multisensory. You have to see, you have to hear, you have to feel the movements of your body. And so it lends itself well for studying some of these principles. So in this study, we had 3 conditions. We put people in our rudimentary driving simulator. This was before Driver Lab was built. And we had them drive a very simple course. They just had to stay within their lane and they had to keep the speed limit. And they either did this with just visual information alone. So they were in the car, but they were not moving and they didn't hear anything, but they were just controlling their driving trajectory using the visual inputs from the virtual reality projection system. And then we had a condition where we added sound cues. So we added wind roar and tire rumble that came from the vehicle, the simulated vehicle. And then we had another condition where we added the motion cues. And so they had the associated accelerations with the 6 degree of freedom motion platform. We looked at a whole bunch of things, but I really will just tell you today about speed variability, mean speed, and the variability in lane keeping across these conditions. And this was done with older and younger adult participants. And so I'll orient you to the graph for speed variability. So you see the younger adults on the left and the older adults on the right. And you can see that they generally performed fairly comparably, except for this visual only condition where older adults were much more variable in their speed than younger adults. But what also might stand out to you is that while younger adults did have some advantage, their variability went down when they had some sound cues, not so much for motion. You'll see that that difference was much bigger for older adults. They became much less variable when they had sound cues, and to some extent when they had motion cues than they did when they had just visual information as well. And we saw generally the same trend with mean speed, where older adults slowed down when sound cues were added. We didn't see quite the same thing for the lane keeping. So this is variability of lane keeping. So again, higher is worse. Younger adults and older adults performed fairly comparably, but you can see for the vision plus motion condition, the older adults actually got a little bit worse when motion was added. And we suspect that maybe this is because you can't perfectly reproduce the physical motions completely in line with the visuals, and there may have been a slight sensory conflict that the older adults may have been more sensitive to. But it's really hard to know because is this greater sensitivity to sensory conflict because of this heightened integration that older adults often experience? Or is this age-related differences in cumulative driving experience? So you can't differentiate these things. And this is one of the challenges of using these more complex realistic tasks, is that there's a history of sensory experiences and behaviors that people have over their lifetime. And in our case, as is typically the case, our older adult participants had a lot more driving experience than younger adults. So maybe they were they had a set of expectations or predictions about how the vehicle would move relative to what they're seeing, which may have been disrupted because of experience or because of this heightened integration. We couldn't really tell. So we did another study and we stripped it down and we did a very basic psychophysical task, a heading discrimination task, also done with Robert in collaboration with Dr. Butler from Dublin. And in this case, they were on the motion platform again, but they were wearing a head-mounted display in this case. And it was a really simple task. They were moved forward once and straight into forward into an angle. And then they were moved a second time. And all they had to judge was in which of those two motions did they move more to the right. So they could have moved right in both of those trials, but in which case did they move more to the right? And of course, what we did here was that we changed all these angles so that sometimes they were very wide and obvious, and sometimes they were very narrow and difficult to differentiate. And we looked at people's differences in their ability, their precision, in their ability to make these judgments, these relative judgments between these heading angles that they were experiencing. And we again did 3 conditions. So we did a visual alone condition where they just sat on the simulator, it did not move in the dark, and they had the head-mounted display on, and they used the optic flow stimuli themselves. And this is a very stripped down optic flow stimulus rather than kind of the contextualized driving task. Vestibular alone, which they were in a cushioned chair, restricted head movements, in the dark, blindfolded, and so they were passively moved. This is the exact same heading angles, movement trajectories, and then combined. So visual information plus that motion information, that vestibular information at the same time. And so when you do this, when you have these 3 conditions, you have a set of expectations. So here are the psychometric functions. We're plotting these are just examples. This is not the actual data. A percentage of rightward responses from 0% to 100%. So when you go to the right, in the positive direction is to the right, when the heading angle is really big, 20-degree difference, 100% of the time, pretty much you'd expect them to say rightward. When it's 20 degrees to the left in the negative direction, 0% of the time you'd expect them to say more rightward. And of course, there's this sweet spot here, and there's the slope of the curve that gives us an indicator of how precise they are at making these judgments. What we would expect based on basic multisensory principles is that when they did just visual alone or just vestibular alone, they would have a certain level of precision. But then when you combine them in this gray line, the precision should be increased. And so we get that from something we call the just noticeable difference as a measure of this precision. And so we got a little tricky with them. we put a sensory conflict in. So for one of the conditions, the visual information, vestibular information telling them the exact same angle, it was congruent. But we also introduced in some blocks a small visual conflict, which means that visually they would be moving straight ahead, but vestibularly, physically they would be moving straight ahead, but visually they'd actually be moving at the same time at a 5-degree angle. Or we made that conflict quite big at a 20-degree angle. So they're going straight ahead physically, but we show them visually in the head-mounted display that they're actually moving at 20 degrees. And what that does, what these sensory conflicts allow us to do, is just to look at their responses and determine, did they go with the vestibular, which was indicating straight ahead, or did they go with the visuals? And then you would have a different set of expectations in terms of how they would respond more rightward. And here that's just representing that at a 5-degree conflict, you would expect there to be a separation across those curves. And so what we found here is when we looked at just the vestibular alone, both older and younger adults estimated heading equally well with just the vestibular cues. Interestingly, when we did vision alone, and this, kind of was similar to what we saw in the driving study, older adults were actually much worse with less precise with vision alone. And 25% of older adults could not even do the task. They were performing at chance in the visual alone. When they were combined and congruent, both sensory information inputs were telling you them the same thing, the same heading angle. Both older and younger adults integrated them optimally. They got that increase in precision with the 2 cues compared to the 1 cue. So here again, in a self-motion context, we're seeing some principles upheld about multisensory integration. This was the interesting part. When there was a sensory conflict that was introduced, this caused caused integration to break down. And what I mean by that is that no longer when they had 2 cues compared to 1 was it being optimized. But that happened for the big conflicts, those 20-degree conflicts for younger adults, which makes sense, right? Visually you're going 20 degrees, vestibularly going straight ahead. Those are probably not related. Let's not integrate. But for older adults, that happened at smaller conflicts. So even at that 5-degree conflict, they were no longer optimally integrating. And in terms of weighting, which one did they use more? Younger adults always weighted the more reliable input higher, but in older adults' vision, which they were not particularly good at, they still gave it more weight than would have been optimal. So they were weighting vision higher, even though vision wasn't the most reliable cue for them. So then we thought, okay, since older adults are actually quite poor at this, especially in the visual only condition, will training help? And so this work was done by Grace in my lab in collaboration with Lawrence and Denise. And the objectives were to see if the precision and accuracy of self-motion perception can be improved with training. And I'll just be mentioning the precision today. And are those training related effects different for older versus younger adults? So we did the exact same thing as the study I just told you about. Heading estimation task, visual alone, vestibular alone, vision plus vestibular combined. In this case, always congruent, never a conflict, always stable. We again looked at these precision-based metrics. But in this case, the difference is that we gave them feedback. So we told them whether or not they were correct or incorrect in their estimate of which one was more rightward. And they did this over 900 trials across 3 different days. So this is a bit of a busy graph, but here we're looking at precision. On the left, we've got older adults, and on the right, we have younger adults. The kind of orangey pink bars are the bimodal conditions when they had both vision and vestibular. The green is the vestibular only, and the blue is the visual only. And In the kind of less saturated colors, this was pre-training. And then the darker colors, the more saturated colors, this is post-training. And so what you can see is that overall, again, older adults were less precise, generally speaking, but particularly in this visual only compared to the younger adults. But what might be most pronounced to you is that there was actually quite a pronounced training related effect, but it was only in the visual condition. So where they had the most improvement to make, they benefited from the training. And an important detail that I don't think I mentioned is that the training was always with bimodal conditions. So they always got those 900 trials with vision combined with vestibular. And so it may be the case that the vestibular information was actually helping to calibrate the poor visual information, but that's a speculation. Okay, so in summary, older adults were less precise than younger adults overall. The precision improved with training, but only for the least precise sensory input. And also, again, not represented in those graphs I just showed you. 27% of older adults in this case could not do the visual only task. So it may be the case that that bimodal training may help to calibrate performance in the less reliable condition. Okay, I just have one more study to present, but I'm gonna pause for a minute because I can't see you, and I just want to make sure everybody's still hearing me and seeing me okay, and see if there's any questions in the chat box.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
There's no question as yet.
Okay. Okay, well then I will continue on and move into this topic about hearing loss, mobility, and falls risk. Okay, so just to kind of paint the picture of sort of the relevance of hearing loss in this context. Hearing loss is actually the #3 highest global burden of disease. It is the 3rd most prevalent chronic health condition in older Canadians. It affects 50% of people over 70 years of age and 80% of people over 80 years of age. There's a greater risk of vehicle collisions with even mild hearing loss. And there's now quite a bit of research that shows that people with hearing loss are at 3 times greater risk of falls, even with mild hearing loss compared to older adults who don't have hearing loss. And at the bottom is just a sort of icon of a hearing aid to remind me to say that hearing aids do not fix hearing loss. They can amplify sound, and they have a lot more sophisticated signal processing algorithms right now to help extract signal from noise. But they're not used in the same way that glasses are to correct for visual acuity. They don't have the same ability to fully correct for hearing loss. And a lot of older adults have what we refer to as hidden hearing loss, which means that they go to the audiologist, and when they're in a perfectly controlled sound booth that controls for all of the external background noise and is essentially an ideal listening condition, they can actually perform quite well and show no evidence of clinical hearing loss. But then when they go into the real world, it becomes more difficult because it's not so much about hearing the sounds, but it's about the brain's job of extracting the signal, say somebody's speech, from the background noise. So let's say all of the noise of a busy restaurant where you're trying to talk to that speech partner. And that's why it's considered hidden, because you can't diagnose it in an audiologist's office, but it's something that they will complain about because it's a problem in their everyday lives, and it's not easy to correct problem. So we're going to just talk briefly here about this particular concern, which is the 3 times greater risk of falls. So why is it whenever you see campaigns on fall prevention, etc., you hear about vision loss, you hear about use of medications, you hear about exercise and loss of muscle mass and muscle tone, lighting, environmental considerations. You rarely hear about hearing, although I think it's starting to get into the narrative a little bit more. And it's perhaps because it's a bit surprising. Why would hearing loss increase the risk of falls? So I think for a lot of people, one of the most intuitive ones is poor spatial hearing. So we have interaural time and level differences that give us an indication of where things are in space. We can use that localization, those localization cues as anchors to support balance, and also to give us indicators, landmark cues to facilitate navigation and to keep us oriented. It's also possible that, and we know this to be true, that hearing loss increases cognitive load. And what I mean by that is when you have a difficult time listening, it takes up a lot more cognitive processing than when you don't have those difficulties. And so listening effort, when it's very effortful to listen, it's taking important cognitive resources away from other things that are important. And so those other things could be, for example, protecting or managing mobility-related requirements. So if you have to listen and walk and navigate at the same time, then that could compromise your mobility and safety. And social isolation is another one that's been kind of discussed, which is just simply that, you know, with hearing loss, you become very disconnected often, which means that you might socially isolate, which means you may become physically and cognitively deconditioned, which could increase your risk of falling. The one I'm going to focus on today, even though we have studied cognitive load, spatial hearing, I'm going to tell you briefly about the work we've done in the paralleled vestibular loss, which is this idea that with, so your auditory system and your vestibular system are both located in your ear. They work in similar ways, and they have shared nerve inputs to the brain. And so it may be the case that declines in your auditory system would be paralleled with declines in your vestibular system. But that had never really been looked at before in the context of age-related hearing loss. So this was work, again, that was done by Grace in collaboration with Sharon, who's an otolaryngologist at SickKids, and Dr. Karen Gordon, Kathy Pecor-Fuller, Lawrence, and my former student, Josh. And so for this study, we put people in a sort of a positional, it's a box, it's a box, a seat that we put cushioning all around them, which you can't see here, fixed their neck, and really tried to prevent a lot of movement of the different body parts or the head. And then this box was put inside the motion platform so that we could strategically introduce different movements to people that they had to discriminate. And so this study was done with, here's a better picture perhaps of the box, with younger adults, older adults with normal hearing, so younger adults and older adults with normal hearing, and older adults with age-related hearing loss. And when they were on the motion platform, I'll show two short videos. There was two movement types that we presented: heave, so up and down movements, and pitch, so rotating forward and backward movements. And they had to do two tasks. One was a movement discrimination task. So they were presented with two movement intervals. And again, this was passively in the dark. And they were asked, in which of those two presented intervals did you move more? In the detection task, they had two intervals again, one in which they moved and one in which they didn't move at all. And so for both of these tasks, what we did, we used a similar kind of psychophysical procedure as the one that I described earlier, which is you start off with those two intervals being very obviously different, very different in magnitude, easy to make those judgments. But then you make the magnitude of the difference smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we get down to the level of precision, the smallest angle at which they can, or the smallest movement at which they can differentiate those two movements. And so that gives us an indication of the sensitivity with which they can use primarily their vestibular system, because they can't use their vision or their hearing, not so much their body, their proprioceptors, in order to perform this task. So here's a heave motion movement. Guess we have to wait for it. It takes a minute to get going. So there we go. So you can see it's a fairly gentle motion. It looks bigger from the outside than it feels on the inside. I always joke that it's not really a joke that, you know, one of the things we had a challenge with is making sure people stay awake because it's a very relaxing task. And then the pitch movement is here. So you'll start to see it rocking back and forth. And they had to make those detection and discrimination judgments for both of those movement types. Okay, so what did we see here? So the first thing I'm showing you at the top here are the heave discrimination on the left and the pitch discrimination on the right. And you'll see that to the far right, this is the older adults with hearing loss. In the middle, older adults with normal hearing. And on the right, the younger adults with normal hearing. And you can see here we're plotting thresholds. So the higher the threshold, the worse they are, the less sensitive they are. And you can see we didn't, even though we see kind of a pattern whereby, oh, and these are individual points or individual subjects, you can see that there's a pattern here whereby older adults with hearing loss are a little bit less sensitive, but this is not significant. Same thing with respect to age. When we look at pitch discrimination, however, you see that the older adults with hearing loss are significantly less precise than older adults with normal hearing and younger adults with normal hearing. When we look at the detection task, so heave detection on the left and pitch detection on the right, we mainly see an age effect. So younger adults are more precise in heave detection than older adults with hearing loss and without hearing loss, and same thing for pitch detection. Okay, so to summarize overall, we see that poor visual self-motion perception and heightened multisensory integration are often observed in older adults compared to younger adults. There was some interesting indicators that cross-modal training may be able to improve some aspects of self-motion perception, especially those for which older adults have the most difficulty with, like the impoverished visual-only conditions. Hearing loss, to some extent, there's some indicators that it may be associated with poor vestibular perception, which may be one, but probably not all of the contributing factors associated with the increased risk of falling. And arguably, hopefully I've convinced you that understanding multisensory and cognitive interactions during some of these controlled but complex tasks could provide unique insights into future strategies for screening and intervention, and also with respect to some of the tech development. So with that, I thank my team and the funders, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you for the very exciting talk. Any question from the audience? You can either just post your question in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. Maybe I'll start off. Sorry, please go ahead.
In your first study, what were the criteria used for selecting the population for that study? I mean, when you were talking about the youngers and olders, I guess I didn't see that information in your slides.
Yep, that's a great question. I know it's always a challenge to kind of fit everything into the presentations, but I can tell you that for nearly all of our studies, we have a database of participants, and we have a baseline assessment session that we run everybody through, which includes an assessment of hearing, of vision, so hearing like pure tone audiometry, self-reported hearing, self-reported vision, visual acuity, contrast sensitivity, cognitive functioning via the MoCA and some other battery of cognitive tests like the trails and the Stroop for inhibitory control. We do the TUG, we do a health history questionnaire. And so essentially, most of the participants in all of the studies that I've shown you are what I would refer to as kind of the cream of the crop older adults, for lack of a better term. So they tend to be people who have passed cutoffs for any kind of clinically relevant impairment in motor, cognitive, or sensory functioning, except for when that's a criteria for the group, such as the hearing loss condition. So, I think that it's probably not representative of the entire older adult population, which is, you know, often the case in a lot of this research that we do. But because we're seeing age-related differences in the parameters that we're studying, it may be actually an underestimate of what we might see in a typical, more representative older adult population, for which there may be more notable declines across those different functions.
Right, thank you.
I have two questions. The first one is that I can see the VR is perfect for this type of experiments, but you also alluded to that sometimes there are artifacts introduced by the technology itself, especially in the experiments with multisensory integration, that maybe it actually introduced some kind of artifact because of the conflicts from different sensory that's produced by the VR platform. So I just wonder, like, whether there's some kind of measure or some, like, for a certain standard, like for particular type of experiments, there's certain requirements that the VR system needs to meet, or to what extent, like, those artifacts would impact the outcome of the experiments.
That's a great question. So I'll answer it in a multi-level approach. So the first one is just about kind of the technology and how do we verify whether or not there actually is any physical measurable conflict. And so we'll do that, for example, in our visual auditory studies. We'll use photometers and oscilloscopes to measure the outputs coming from the system to ensure that there isn't a lag between the two and that they are aligned temporally. And so we can do that for some studies, and it's a little bit trickier to do for other studies. But when we can do it, we obviously do the verification using objective measurements. The second thing is that actually in the real world, we have what we refer to as temporal and spatial windows of integration. So things do not need to be exactly temporally and spatially aligned. Two sensory inputs do not need to be 100% aligned in order to be integrated. It's within a window. So it can, so a good example of this, I think, is when you think of the auditory and visual system, if there's a sound that's being emitted from an object that's right in front of you, the amount of time that the light and the sound is going to take to get to your eye and ear and be processed by the brain will be more temporally aligned because it's close by. And so there's not a travel time difference. But if you see something that's far away, the amount of time that it's going to take for that sound to travel to your ear is going to be much longer, like much, compared to what our sensory systems are able to pick up. And so there has to be flexibility in our processing to account for the fact that in our real world, there are going to be temporal conflicts, so to say. And so this window allows some leeway there so that you can say that within a certain number of milliseconds, it's allowable. The brain will allow there to be some conflict. It's advantageous. It's not advantageous for the brain to be too rigid on that, because that's not the way that we experience things in our real world. But it is a window, and it does have cut points. So in VR, what we have to be careful about is that we don't exceed that bandwidth or those windows. And so that's typically okay. But in the case of the motion platform, it's a bit trickier. It's easy to control if you're presenting them with pre-established motion profiles. So if you know for sure that you want to move them to the left and move them to the right and at a specific angle, there's almost no conflict. I think it's very tolerable. But the situations where it becomes more problematic is where your system can't predict what the user is going to do next. So if you're in a head-mounted display-based system and you rapidly move your head and you rapidly translate in space, the system has to keep up with that. And that's where you may experience more lags and more conflicts. And some of the work that we do in our lab is related to cyber sickness, simulator sickness, these adverse side effects that can happen in VR. And that's typically when they happen. So the answer is, we try to avoid it by using objective measurements. We try to avoid it by using very kind of prescribed types of trajectories when possible. And when we can't, we try to determine what the potential conflict is and sort of account for that or understand that to be a limitation in some of the research.
That's interesting. Basically, you need to use with caution, right?
Yeah, and you know what? It's not going to be a be-all solution. There are going to be things that it's very well suited for, and things that you absolutely should avoid it at all cost and just operate in the real world. That's where, you know, you want to apply the work. That's where you should be doing it. It's just when it gives you those added advantages, like you can defy the laws of physics and optics in VR. And when you want to be able to do that, you use VR. You can't do that in the real world. But if you want to mimic the everyday experiences in a controlled way, and you can do it in the real world, then you should always do it in the real world.
Right. I see Dylan's hands is up. I will let him ask first, and then maybe you have time, we can talk more. Dylan, please.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the great presentation, Jennifer. It was great to see, you know, the space and the amazing work that you do there. I have a number of questions, but I'll keep them pretty short. I think the first one, I was surprised to see that older adults were relying more on their visual information as opposed to the vestibular information in the first study that you talked about, especially based on the fact that they seem to do better with the vestibular information. So I guess just briefly, do you have any thoughts on that, or how we can maybe utilize that a bit more in terms of rehab or things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we don't know for sure, but there is, in like fundamental research, again, going back to these kind of single cell recording studies in multisensory neurons, there's a principle called the principle of inverse effectiveness. And what that means, what that principle states and is shown in the firing of a single multisensory neuron, is that if you present that neuron with two inputs that are weak or have low reliability, you actually get an enhanced firing rate, a super additive firing rate, compared to if you just presented a single sensory input to that neuron. So let's say you had, you know, a visual input, it would have a certain firing rate. An auditory input, it would have a certain firing rate. And if you have a visual plus auditory input, it has a super additive effect. And so it means it's greater than the sum of its parts, so to say. That super additive effect of having 2 versus 1 cues is actually bigger when you have weak signals than when you have strong signals. So when you have strong signals, you can use one or the other. So combining them doesn't give you such a boost. But if you have weak signals, combining them is super important because they're each telling you some information that's helpful, and you get a boosted signal that's super additive. And so I think what we see for older adults across a whole bunch of different studies and different domains is that what we say is that they have heightened integration, which means they're getting that super additive boost more than younger adults. And as I was mentioning in one of my slides, sometimes that's really good, right? Because it's beneficial, you get a boost. But if you have that heightened integration, it can sometimes be bad. Like in that case, in that study, we actually introduced a conflict. And so if you're obligatorily integrating those sensory inputs when they're each telling you something different, it's going to be disadvantageous. And so in that case, that's kind of what we saw, which is that even though their vision was so poor, like you said, their visual estimates were so poor, they looked to be still integrating them non-optimally, not what we would expect based on these fundamental principles. So they were not showing this optimal cue weighting, is how we would say it. But the thing that I find kind of reassuring or encouraging, I guess, is the training study. Because if you remember in the training study, we paired these poor visuals, poorly reliable visuals, with a highly reliable vestibular signal. And we knew, like you said, the older adults could do the vestibular only task very well. And we paired those two things together over and over and over and over again. And then after training, their visual estimates improved significantly compared to before training, which makes me think, well, we have to do more studies, obviously. And with respect to your question about what are the implications in practice, is that if you have a sensory system that's poor, by strategically combining it with feedback from other sensory systems that are stronger, in a repetitive, and also I think there's some other evidence by other researchers that show it does have to be fairly like targeted and specific rather than just kind of everyday experiences in which you're going to get that anyways. Then you could have improvements in that kind of impaired system. So that was a long answer. Sorry. I hope it was along the lines of what you're thinking.
That makes sense. And I think it sounds really similar to, what we think of with respect to this group when we're doing a lot of wearable sensor type stuff of like a Kalman filter, right? Of getting different ratings from different things and trying to weight those to come to our final sort of best estimate. It's, we're doing the same thing as those things are. So again, thanks for that.
Great. Yeah. And that is not my area of expertise, but I work with a lot of other smart people, and they apply Kalman filters and use maximum likelihood estimation and Bayesian models and use very similar strategies, but applied in the context of multisensory perception. So a lot of borrowed and complementary approaches.
Yeah, we seem to follow a lot of the body stuff.
Oh, sorry, yeah. No, I was gonna say, what is this building behind you? Where are you located on campus?
I'm in the Ivor Wind Center, so I'm in the kinesiology building. They're doing construction back there as always.
So I'm a Mac graduate. I did my PhD at McMaster. I spent a lot of time in Ivor Wind, and I worked with Jim Lyons and Digby Elliott and Tim Lee and those guys. Yep. And I love going back to McMaster campus, but I did it in psychology. That was where my degree is in psychology. So it's very nostalgic seeing your background.
Yeah, there's a lot of new buildings around here, so you'll have to make a trip out here and see some of the new spaces. A lot of old ones still, though. Our buildings feel like it's original from,
Classic.
Dylan, do you have further question? Jennifer, how's your time? Just want to make sure.
No, I'm good.
We are kind of okay. I just have a question. I think that might benefit the audience. It's wonderful to have those state-of-the-art facilities in your lab. I wonder, like, if a researcher is interested to, for example, do some experiments, but they don't have access, for example, in Mac, is there a procedure that we can do so? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, so when we built these facilities, it was very clear that the intention was to make this a resource that's open to everybody. So it's not exclusive to people who work at Kite. We have lots of people coming externally to come and do projects. So it's a matter. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. So students sometimes come and do outside projects. Sometimes we have industry partners come and there's a fee for service, and sometimes we have co-funded, projects for which some components take place in the SEAL labs. So I would just encourage anybody, if there was something that was exciting to you that you thought would be of great use to your research or your research interests, then you can reach out to me. I'm the chief scientist of the SEAL facilities that I described today, so I can help coordinate that process as well.
I think that's wonderful. Let's see. I have a small question on you did not touch upon the spatial hearing cues. How would that affect a risk of fall? I'm just a little curious, like to what extent that would increase the risk, like compared to the other factors that you mentioned.
Yeah, so there's some research that has been done by others, and we're just in the process. We're conducting a study right now, so I can't tell you the answer from our study. But what they do, what has been done previously is if you introduce auditory landmark cues, then in many cases it actually leads to improved balance performance, more stabilized balance performance than if you have no auditory landmark cues present. So if you think of, analogous to visual cues, where if you have a fixation point, for example, it stabilizes, it can stabilize your posture. It would be something comparable to that, where you have these potential anchors, these auditory anchors that might serve a similar function. But in order to access those, you have these, very, very small differences between in terms of the time for which a sound arrives to your one ear compared to where it arrives to your other ear, these inaural time differences and the slight level differences between the ear. This is what we use for localization. And if you have a very localized sense of where you are, you can imagine that it may support your orientation, your posture in space, but also your ability to navigate within that space. So you're probably very familiar with the concept of echolocation. So people who are blind or who have low vision can use the reverberations of sound and sound cues to navigate in their environment. But we actually all do that to some extent. It's just we may not use that as much if we don't have to rely on it. So we're looking at this in the context of hearing aid users. So we want to know that if we provide these spatial sound cues compared to white noise or no sound cues, is their posture better in their aided condition compared to unaided? And do these sound cues, because we know that hearing aids are actually not that great at restoring spatial sound, but do the sound cues do anything more to facilitate balance? So we're doing that right now in our street lab, our virtual reality kind of projection screen environment, because we also wanted to mimic, being in a being in a city intersection. So, kind of simulating real world. You're in the middle of a city intersection. You've got some sound cues, not visualized, but sound cues. How are those helpful to you in order to maintain your balance? We use a force plate and do some posturography.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We did some work on the binaural sound localization, spatialization. I never actually know there's a connection with fall risks. And you're right, like a lot of hearing aids, they are not very good at restoring the temporal aspect of the binaural hearing, and actually disrupted the signal that make spatialization, localization harder. Yeah, it's interesting to see your work in that regards.
Yeah, and I don't know, honestly, that anyone's done a really good job looking at binaural hearing and falls risk particularly, even though I kind of highlighted in that way. They've looked at it more narrowly in terms of balance and posturography during, fairly easy, stationary kind of quiet standing balance type situations, rather than during like these more dynamic type of tasks. So anyway, so there's kind of an indirect potential link with falls risk, but I'm not sure that link has actually been made empirically.
It's interesting. I see Thomas raise your hand first. Thomas is still there?
Yeah, hello?
Please go ahead.
Hi.
Hey, sorry, my headset died on me like halfway through, so I didn't hear everything. But so I was also late to this, but it was a very interesting presentation, and I thought it was very interesting how you started talking about like echolocation, how that works, and obviously orienting yourself in space. Have we considered, I guess as the research progresses, therapeutic applications for this VR stuff as well? The reason I'm bringing up echolocation as well is because as someone who might lose their vision, could this type of technology also be used to help train them in that echolocation, for example, to then help them learn to orient a little bit better, a little faster, gain more confidence in themselves after having lost said sense, or some other application outside of maybe the current approach that you have, or just general adoption for other types of losses of senses?
That is a great question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question of is there currently an intervention that trains people with vision loss or prospective vision loss to use echolocation abilities? That would be fascinating. I really don't know, but it seems like VR could actually have very good potential to be able to do that, as long as you have the right acoustical setup, because those things get very precise. And so, you know, making sure that you're getting all of these things right with respect to the Doppler effect, and, you know, the spatial sound cues are going to be really important, I think, in order to make that usable. And then the question is, you know, in that situation, are real world environments better or easier? I'm not sure, but I can see potential on both sides. In terms of the kind of some of the therapeutic intervention work, I mean, there's tons of stuff with respect to VR in clinical application. I think actually, I wonder if I have, are you still seeing my slides?
I am, yes.
Okay, so I think I have maybe a slide here on this. I should just probably, oh, here. Yeah, so there's, you know, there's tons, right? So you can use VR in the context of cognitive training, exposure therapy for like PTSD, distraction techniques, for example, during surgeries, for reminiscence therapy in persons with dementia, relaxation and mindfulness, telerehab, telehealth, remote health monitoring, you know, exercise-based training, cognitive training, and then in the context of professional development, you know, teaching modules, medical imaging, and then of course in the context of empathy or perspective taking. So, you know, putting someone in VR from the perspective of someone who has glaucoma or macular degeneration or dementia, for example. So these are all, there's tons of different applications that it's broadly being used for. In the context of some of the work that I talked about today, we're looking more at other types of interventions and testing the effects of those interventions in VR. So I could give you one example. For the hearing loss mobility theme, I mentioned that one of the hypothesized associations between poor mobility, and I only talked about falls risk, but there's a lot of other mobility related outcomes in terms of gait and other kind of biomechanical outcomes that they've shown is also affected by hearing loss. So anyways, poor mobility and falls risk could be related to cognitive load, meaning that they have less cognitive reserve to support these mobility related activities. So one of the things that we're doing right now through a CIHR funded project with Concordia, it's led by Dr. Karen Lee, is we're doing a established cognitive training program with people older adults who have hearing loss and who don't have hearing loss. And they come in and they do all our battery of sensory cognitive motor tests, and then they get into Street Lab and they do some realistic, multisensory, multitasking kind of tests. So like walking across a busy Toronto intersection while having to listen to 3 friends at the same time and repeat back something that one of those friends is saying, just as an example. And then they go off for 12 weeks and they do brain training. They do cognitive training using a program that has been kind of established to have improvements, particularly in executive functioning. And then they're going to come back into Street Lab and they're going to do all of those tests again. And so what we're hoping is that in those 12 weeks, they're going to increase potential cognitive capacity, increase cognitive reserve, the amount of cognitive space that, you know, can be used to manage all these different tasks, so that the consequences of having to listen and walk at the same time won't be as pronounced as pre-training. So that would be one example of an intervention that's ongoing right now.
Cool. Can I have a quick follow-up question for that then too? Because obviously as software engineers, we wouldn't have the know-how to evaluate a lot of these things. So I assume there's a lot of interdisciplinary stuff going on here between maybe, because you said your background was in psychology, for example. So I'm assuming this facility then is littered with people of all sorts of different backgrounds, whether it be psychology, software engineering, social work.
Yes.
knows?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that's a great a point to make. So at Kite, about a third of our trainees, maybe a little more than that, are from engineering and computer science. So mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, biomechanical engineering, even industrial engineering, and then a third-ish are from clinical areas. So we have a lot of physiotherapy, occupational therapy, kinesiology, psychology, psychiatry, and then the other group is in like public health, epidemiology, policy, commercialization. So it really is very interdisciplinary and interprofessional. And because it is in a hospital, we also have access to a lot of different clinical facilities and assessments and patient populations as well.
That is super cool. Thank you.
Okay, Tiago, you have your hand up. So this is our last question.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if it's a silly question, but I will ask it anyways. In your research, are you also interested in detecting at an earlier stage any possible disease or impairment associated with the decline of sensory response, or just how people respond? I mean, the decision-making process kind of thing involved when healthy or impaired people are in doing certain tasks or activities?
Okay, that's not a silly question at all. It's a really great question.
Okay.
So I mean, I like at the beginning of your question, you kind of asked about, are we doing anything? I think in the context of kind of prediction, or looking maybe for some biomarkers, or looking for kind of anticipatory components of what might change over time, or how there may be increased risk of decline or things like that. Is that, am I interpreting it right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So so actually maybe I even go back to my slides. We have a I may have passed it, or oh, here it is. Okay. So yeah, so we did a study, and this was in the context of early markers of cognitive decline, not so much in sensory decline, but they kind of go together in some ways. It was done by Sophie. So one thing I didn't tell you is that hearing loss is also a major risk factor for dementia. And you may not believe me when I say this, but there's several Lancet papers that have come out in recent years showing that of all the potentially modifiable risk factors for dementia, including obesity and smoking and exercise and all those kinds of things, the number one is hearing loss. So this is the number one potentially modifiable risk factor, and there's lots of reasons why this may be the case. But there's something in terms of something that's referred to as subjective cognitive decline. So what this means is that someone's subjective perception, not the objective perception, not what their clinical neuropsychologist is going to tell them, but they themselves feel that their memory or thinking is getting worse without test-related results that would corroborate that. So this has been talked about as the stage when the patient knows that they're experiencing cognitive decline, but the doctor doesn't know. And so there's evidence that shows that there's increased biomarker abnormalities in people with SCD that's consistent with Alzheimer's disease pathologies. They're also at increased risk of falls and sensory declines. So this kind of all goes together. And there's some longitudinal associations with hearing loss. And so people who express subjective cognitive decline are a good target for early screening, because right now there's no way of verifying whether or not they actually have cognitive decline, or starting to have cognitive decline, or if they're part of the worried well. They're well, but they're just worriers. And so you have to differentiate those. And this is, commonly the case because if you go to a neuropsychologist's office, it's in a quiet environment, there's no distractions, you're doing paper and pencil tests, and people can manage it well. when they're subjectively feeling like there's a problem, it's because they're in their everyday lives and they're having to manage a million things and, you know, multitasking, multisensory, etc. And this is when they are subjectively feeling like they're not doing as well as they once were. So we did this in Street Lab, what we call a brain stress test. And so what we are saying here is not we're making them anxious. It's kind of like a cardiac stress test. So when you go for a cardiac stress test, you're looking at the upper working capacities of the heart. When you do a brain stress test, as we're calling it, it's how do you manage these multisensory, multitasking challenges in your everyday lives. So we mimicked that in virtual reality. And long story short, we saw some differentiators between older adults who had subjectively normal cognition. They didn't express problems beyond what would be expected at their age, compared to the people who had SCD. So that would be one example of something that I think you were asking about.
Yeah, so, okay, thank you very much. So it's really interesting, this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago.
Okay, so let's come to an end of the seminar. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the wonderful talk and the detailed answers to all the questions. I would also like to thank everyone for attending.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed it. And I look forward to visiting you at McMaster soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Have a nice weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah, you too.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.